This week, I am joined by none other than Matt Alderman. He's in place of John Strand this week, and in our first segment, we are going to interview Harry Sverdlove. He's the Chief Technology Officer over at Edgewise. We're going to talk about Zero Trust Segmentation. It's going to be a lot of fun. Then, in the enterprise security news, Symantec makes 2 acquisitions this week. Threat Quotient has an integration. Firemon delivers some new and exciting functionality. StackPath makes a partnership, and some more acquisition and funding updates from the likes of Veracode, Shape Security, Tomo Bravo, and more. So stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Improve the efficiency and effectiveness of your security operations with DF Labs security orchestration, automation, and response technology. Automate threat containment, orchestrate incident response, and measure operational performance with DF Labs in-command SOAR platform. Leverage your current security resources to minimize incident resolution time, maximize analyst efficiency, increase the number of incidents handled, and reduce overall risk. In-command SOAR acts as a force multiplier, enabling your security team to do more with less. Streamline the full incident response lifecycle automation process today. Keep your cybersecurity incidents under control with DF Labs. Visit dflabs.com/security weekly and request to see in-command SOAR live in action. Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer's sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Welcome everyone to episode 114 of Enterprise Security Weekly, being recorded on November 7th, 2018. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. Matt Alderman, who's currently the CEO of Security Weekly. It sounds so weird to say it still. It hasn't like fully sunk in, Matt. But it's great to be back working with you again.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, we announced kind of prematurely last week on ESW, so we've done this a couple weeks in a row. Yeah. But I think it's day 4, 5. Today's day 5. Yeah, because Thursday's the 1-week anniversary. So still working through the kinks, but at least the shows are going well.
That's it. Yeah, happy that you could host. John Strand's just been really busy. I think for most penetration testing firms, Q4, specifically November and December, are very, very busy for them, because I think everyone realized, and I remember this when I was running a pen test company. November would hit and they go, oh, we got to do our pen test for the end of the year. And then like everyone seems to come out of the woodwork and go, I want to do a pen test for the end of the year. So those folks get really busy. But I think he'll be back in not next week, but the following. So quick announcement, our webcast with Signal Sciences, which way should you shift testing in the SDLC? This is going to be held tomorrow from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences, where you can hear from myself, Larry Pesce, and Zane Lackey. That's right. 2 people arguably more famous than I am, which is kind of funny. I have an inside story about Zane being famous. Zane's name comes up a lot on a lot of different briefing calls and such, all in a good light. So you're definitely going to want to check out this webcast, as we're going to teach you about the SDLC, the various components, and the benefits of shifting really in either direction. So make sure you register for that. And now, I'd like to bring on our featured guest for today. This is, of course, a sponsored interview by Edgewise. It was one of our latest partners, and we're happy to have them on board. You can go to edgewise.net/Security Weekly. Register there to get more information, which you should, because we really like their products. We like their position in the market, hence, bringing them on and working with them. And we're lucky to have Harry Sverdlove with us. He was previously the CTO of Carbon Black, as well as spent some time at McAfee. You've had a stellar career in security, Harry, and currently he is the CTO and founder of Edgewise. Harry, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, wonderful to have you. I wanted to talk first about when we talked about, zero trust segmentation, which I believe is the tagline currently on your website, which I really like. The way that I understood it, and I want to just dive right into the thing that helped me understand it, was when I thought about authentication and getting rid of passwords, right? Nobody likes passwords. And I sit down at my desk in the morning, and the software that's going to authenticate me looks at a lot of different factors, right? Looks at my phone, looks at the location of my phone. My phone's connected to the same Wi-Fi network as it always is. My computer's connected to that same Wi-Fi network. The headset that's maybe connected to my computer or phone has that same Bluetooth ID that it has for maybe a year. And I'm holding my phone the same way. My mouse moves in the same way. And the software says, you're good, Paul. Like, you don't really have to give me anything extra in terms of authentication. But if those factors change, or I change location, I'm logging in from China, then there's various levels. It may require a password. It may require my two-factor authentication token. And what I realized was that Edgewise basically has built that for applications. And I'm like, that's like a why didn't I think of that kind of moment? And I'm like, that's awesome. So Harry, I know we've talked, and that I think is a good way of thinking of it. Certainly helped me understand the value that's provided by your products. So.
I think that's a great way to sort of sum it up. We kind of all have this understanding of multi-factor authentication for users, where you've got your phone, your location, your device ID, all of these different attributes, and different ones are used depending on the environment. So if you're in China, as you said, you might get an additional authentication request or something else because the environment isn't as secure. We're fairly familiar with that kind of concept, but what happens when we're talking about what's really being the target of attacks? Workloads, servers, data centers, where there's no user that's going to sit there and enter a code. There's no biometric that you can do. And how do you do essentially multi-factor authentication for the systems that are running automatically or running non-interactively? And that principle is exactly the principle that forms the zero trust networking that Edgewise applies to data centers and to cloud computing.
And I think it's a really great problem to tackle. I mentioned my time spent as a penetration tester, and I think people think it's in the movies, and there's this really sexy factor about it. But oftentimes, as all of us know on the panel today and many listening, pen testing is really about, hey, look, I can connect to that service and it doesn't authenticate me properly, or it's not configured properly, and therefore I can gain traction and get in the inside of the network. I mean, that's essentially the part of the issue with hacking is, even going back to an incident we had a Docker instance and its API was exposed to the internet. And so we had a security incident. And I think that's where a lot of it, a security incident stem from, is not the sexy hacking, but it's that authentication of connections to services and applications, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's common basic hygiene. And exactly what you said, which is whether it's because of a known vulnerability or a user error, you exposed an API, any number of factors. There's 19 CVEs reported every single day. So new vulnerabilities come all the time. The awareness is basically you are going to get breached. That doesn't mean you're going to get compromised, but it means that it's very easy for an attacker or even an insider to gain access to a system inside your network. And if we deal with this model of, well, we assume if you're inside, you're trusted. So you go ahead and do what you got to do because we've already authenticated you. That's going to be a failing proposition, especially if we consider that you are already inside. And if we start taking a look at our infrastructure and say, what if we assume it doesn't matter if you're inside, outside, in China, in a coffee shop, in a workplace, your network, assume it's always infected, then how would you go about securing those communications and those activities?
Yeah, and that gets tricky because of all the different ways, both legacy and new, that we have to deploy applications. I remember back in the day, I'd rack physical servers, and now today, I don't even really need a container, right? We can go right to serverless, and I can just drop my application in the cloud. So How in your solutions, Harry, how are you able to manage those connections and requests, given the all these different ways we have to deploy applications and servers today?
No, absolutely. And by the way, on that note, when I started Edgewise, one of the things I miss is I miss having a rack.
Right.
I miss having a rack space with all the blinky lights that go green and red, and that worst case scenario you could unplug it.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So those form factors, the way we used to do things, if you think about firewalls and traditional firewalls, it's a form factor that you plug your network into and you plug a tap into it, or you basically plug your pipes through it. Well, when that form factor is gone, there's nowhere to plug in. There's no plugs, if you will, in the cloud. And the way we deal with this at Edgewise is we actually do our monitoring at the host level. And we monitor communications both to serverless as well as managed servers. But it doesn't matter if they're physical, if they're virtual, if they're in China, or if they're in US East or US West. The only way you can truly ascertain what is the identity of the entities that are communicating is to be there at that point when they are communicating and where they are communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we talk about agents, but I think the way it's gone, I think a few years ago, everyone was kind of really anti-agent. I mean, Matt and I were actually working at Tenable, right? And, we talk about agents, and there was a lot of anti-agent. But I think today, because of all the different ways you can deploy servers and applications, people are coming around to, to have that level of functionality, I need to have an agent, and people are okay with it. Do you find that there's been kind of a shift in that arena?
Well, there's definitely been a shift. The way I kind of think of agents is I kind of think of it the same way that Winston Churchill says about democracy. It's the worst form of government. It's just better than all the rest. If we could do what we want to do without an agent, I would do this tomorrow.
Right.
But if you think about, doing network security or doing communication security from the wire, that's basically sitting at the bottom of a swimming pool, which is your network, looking up, trying to ascertain who's walking by. And all the images are fuzzy. You really don't know who's there. You actually have to be above the swimming pool to see who's walking by, who's communicating. And so you're absolutely right, especially when you have legacy systems, hybrid networks, elastic systems, constantly changing addresses. To be there, whether it's in container, sidecar, in the host, there's definitely a temperature and awareness that, unfortunately or fortunately, it is the best place to get the best and most accurate telemetry. And I think certainly, in the last decade, the technology has advanced enough that agents really aren't as anathema as they once used to be.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about the telemetry that you collect. And, I started off with the example that I can understand of the user, right, who wants to log in. But how does that translate to the different types of telemetry and data points that you collect to start making decisions about basically what can talk to what?
Right. So if you think about what is it that you want to actually authenticate, you want to authenticate identity, you want to authenticate environment, and you want to authenticate transaction. And all three of those coordinate to decide whether or not something is trustworthy. So in the case of identity, one of the things that Edgewise gathers is we gather a number of attributes about all of the processes that are requesting communications. Immutable attributes such as its cryptographic hash, its location, its file size, if it's digitally signed, its digital certificate, information about that, loaded modules. And these are things that represent the identity of the software or the workload that's communicating. Then you have the environment, which is, the UUID, the CPU ID of the system you're running under, other environmental factors. In the example of MFA that you were talking about, environment might be if you're in China. So something that's different that might require a level of additional trust. And then, of course, there's the transaction. What is it you're trying to do? So one of the challenges with this idea of just making black and white decisions or good and bad decisions based solely on identity is a lot of the software we have running, they're dual use. So you take something like Java or PowerShell or even a browser, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. So it's not that just the identity alone is enough to ascertain, do I trust it? But if Java's accessing your database, maybe that's trustworthy. And all of a sudden now Java's trying to query your Active Directory or trying to query your financial software. The identity of the software is still sound, but the transaction, what it's requesting, is no longer sound. So what we do is we gather these identity attributes coupled with environment attributes and then look at the transaction that's being requested. And policies are made off of identity plus transaction.
Oh, sorry, you're breaking up there at the end, Harry. It looks like Harry's kind of frozen. The wonders of technology and the internet.
It's usually me who gets, locked up on the internet. So
right.
Yeah.
Did I?
Oh, are you back, Harry?
I'm back. Was that me who blipped out?
Yeah. It was just towards the end of what you were saying earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with. So somebody out there doesn't want me talking about this stuff.
That's it. Well, I think it's interesting too that when you talk about processes that, like you have a browser and you may trust like your browser going out to the internet, but when I look at what the attackers are doing, is they're really using technologies like PowerShell and other like living off the land kind of activities. And at some point, I find the best detections are going, well, that process really doesn't have a use for that. Like, why is that, PowerShell script downloading every single user in the domain? Or, why is that browser trying to inject into some other DLL that it never should, inject into? And I really think that in the detection game, that's what can be effective at stopping attackers today.
That's absolutely right. And that's why a lot of times, and you hear this, it's a buzzword, but you hear machine learning applied. Edgewise does this as well, which is if you observe, and one of the things we do is we observe what are the patterns of communication that are happening in your environment and build out models of what is predictive or appropriate behavior. And so you're absolutely right. In some organizations, maybe you have a Python script that does some funky things because DevOps is using it once a month to do something. But in most organizations, you're going to find there's a lot of dual use tools that don't have any legitimate business use. And they're sitting there waiting for somebody to come live off the land, take a quote unquote trustworthy piece of software and use it for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, so this is similar to what I've seen in other technologies, right? You're trying to understand behavior and then try to enforce that behavior, right? So what it sounds like is you're monitoring what different applications are doing, connections they're making. You're starting to understand behavior and also starting to wrap rules around it that says this app can do these things, but it can't do these other things, right? And is that kind of how the policy rules get generated ultimately from an enforcement perspective?
Yeah, definitely. At a high level, that's absolutely right. I think one of the things that makes this unique is we do this a lot simpler than you might think. If you think about traditional, the old style HIPS, which is very complicated host-based behavior detection because it looked at what registry settings is modifying, what is it doing to the file system. There's so many attributes that are essentially that are very mutable and software changes. What we're focused on specifically is who are you communicating with? And when that key behavior, because at the end of the day, if you're going to attack something, you have to move laterally or you have to exfiltrate data. You have to make communications. And that's the focused attribute we're working on and that we enforce based on your identity, the environment, and who is it you want to communicate with. So that very narrow set of behaviors allows the model to coalesce very quickly and to be resilient to all these other changes. Software is going to change. Your applications are going to change. Of course, they're going to change. But who they need to communicate with, that doesn't change as often.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, a lot of people think about, well, that's going to be complicated and I don't know how it's going to do that. But have you ever tried to do it like with just a firewall? Because I have. And I tell you what, you get it wrong 100% of the time. And it may not be right away. You can, and this was my project when I worked at the university when we first started implementing firewalls, right? It lets everything through. I'd analyze the logs. I'd go start adding rules. And as soon as I got to a certain point of being restrictive, there was always exceptions. And those exceptions weren't necessarily apparent right that day. It could be the next week when that batch job runs, that runs every week. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I missed that. And they're like, why didn't that run? Well, because, it's the firewall. And so doing that manual analysis, I think you get it wrong all the time. And you need that machine learning. You need something that's helping you understand and then allowing you to make decisions.
Yeah, when I describe machine learning, I don't describe it with artificial intelligence because it's not sentient. It's not Skynet. It's the type of thing that if you had an infinite number of humans sitting with an infinite amount of time, you could do it. But, the problem also with firewalls is ultimately, there are so many variations, especially when you start dealing with elastic environments and data centers, that you inevitably end up with any-to-any rules. You create these very broad brushed highways because it's too granular. And one of the things that we found is when you actually start looking instead of at addresses, but actually application identity and pathways, that we've achieved at least an order of 5 to 6 orders of reduction. So if you take a typical firewall, you're going to get 200 million events a day.
Right.
Of those, about 1 million of them are unique based on source address, destination address, port protocol. If you were to try to actually describe them in rules, you're going to end up with easily 10 to 20,000 different rules. We were able to, once we actually remove addresses, literally cancel them out of the equation and look at software communicating with software. So Postgres or Java speaking to Postgres, or App Server speaking to Java, or your load balancer, Nginx speaking to your business application. We're able to take that same environment and describe it fully in about 120, sometimes just a few dozen rules.
Yeah, I think the way to describe this a little bit is it's kind of like a distributed application firewall, right? Your distribution point's the endpoint, but it's really at the application communication layer is where these rules are being enforced. So it's distributing that instead of having like a central choke point like you would in a traditional firewall deployment.
Definitely. And one of the things we talk about, and we think it's a far more secure and manageable scenario, is you move that control plane as close to the thing you're trying to control. In this case, it's the workload. So instead of having these choke points, which often end up being also a performance impact on your network because you have to reroute everything through them, they're also a single point of failure. And we move that control plane down to the workload itself.
That's awesome. So when customer is deploying this or trying it for the first time, I guess kind of like walk us through the process. I'm assuming they have to deploy the agents, and then there's monitoring mode that happens, and then rules start taking place after that. Like, what's that process look like?
Absolutely. So one of the things we strive to do, as you mentioned, it is an agent, and it's a dynamically loadable and unloadable kernel module. So it can be deployed without restarting, and it can be undeployed or removed without restarting your systems, which is pretty important when you're dealing with back office or servers and data centers. You deploy our agent, we provide Chef or Puppet scripts so that you can easily integrate it in your software distribution process. Once the agent's out there and it's within immediately, it just starts monitoring. It does two things. It monitors identity of applications, who's communicating, and it also does this, what we call a attack surface analysis, where for every application that's listening on your network, it creates these half-open probes so that we can tell the user not just what's communicating, but what can communicate, which allows you to then quantify within about an hour, you start seeing in our dashboard results that'll show you your applications and not only how many pathways they are using, but how many pathways are actually available, a measure of their overexposure, which helps you just determine risk. In most cases, what we found is most networks, because of this any-to-any and over-permissiveness that's sort of necessary with firewalls, are about 90% plus overexposed. So for every 100 ways there are to get to your database, you only need maybe 5 that are actually in use. So we profile that. You can immediately start building rules if you want to, but our machine learning system is also doing the analysis. And within 24 to 48 hours, we start providing recommendations as to here are rules that we are observing. We reach about a 99.99% coverage within 48 hours for most networks. And at that point, you can either choose to accept recommendations, you can create your own rules. One of the other things we do is, because you want to be as flexible as possible, is we look at how applications are clustered. So that sometimes a rule isn't an application to an application, but rather this collection of business apps, I just want them to be able to talk amongst themselves. And as a whole, I want them to be able to talk to my database. And all of that, those analysis and recommendations occur within the, like I say, first 24 to 48 hours.
That's fantastic. And then I'm assuming there's some kind of reporting and monitoring, right? And how are customers, once they've implemented it, taking the monitoring of that behavior and then, building it into their response and analysis processes?
Absolutely. So, it's very similar, like most every security technology. If you think about sort of the NIST workflow of identify, detect, protect, respond, it's the same exact model. With Edgewise, the first thing is you identify what your assets are. And that's what our agent does automatically. It identifies all the workloads and identifies how they're communicating. detect. This is mapping out what those pathways are, providing a model that describes your organization. Protect is when you start applying policies. But some customers, for example, don't initially go to protect. Excuse me. They go to monitor, and they just want to know. I want to be alerted when there are deviations from the model. So it's not a learn mode and then an apply mode. We're constantly learning. So for every 100 events we do, we take the first 90%, we build our models, and we apply them to the next 10%, so that we're constantly relearning, reapplying, and we'll alert you whenever there's a deviation to the model, whether or not you choose to protect. But then, of course, most customers will then start protecting their assets. And honestly, while I'd love to say, you just click protect, you change your entire network overnight. That's not realistic. What people tend to do, and customers do, is they pick different projects or different areas, and they say, I'm going to protect this particular application, or I'm going to protect this sensitive database, and then build degrees out. And one of the things we'll show you with each of your assets is we show you those attack pathways so that you can see, if I were an attacker, for example, coming from the internet, here's all of the different ways I can take hops, 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees from the internet to get to that asset. And so you can start building rings of protection, degrees of freedom away from the things you want to protect.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. And to do that at the application layer, that's the right call. I like that.
Yeah, and the detect and respond is yeah, and detect and respond people are familiar with, right? It's monitoring, it's detecting, it's getting integrated into your SIM or into your SOC processes. Protection, though, is the one that takes a while, right? Because you've got to earn that trust that you're actually protecting the right things, that you're not bringing down the business. So I can see how that kind of starts in certain areas and grows over time. Ultimately, you hope you can put all those protection mechanisms in place, but at least they have the detection and response side to deal with those incidents they're not trying to block or enforce at that point.
Exactly. In fact, I actually changed my position. I used to suggest and recommend for protect, start with your most critical, or what I called your most toxic assets, because of course those are the ones that have the highest value. And actually, I was listening to Chase Cunningham from Forrester, who's a strong, obviously, proponent of zero trust networking, and his recommendation, and I think this is brilliant, is start with a project that you can be successful at. It doesn't have to be your critical one. Start with something that you're comfortable with, that you know the most, and gain and build a success with protect, and then build on that success, because it's a psychological thing too, to actually expand out. So of course, obviously, from a prioritization, there are certain assets that are higher risk. But if you're going to change your posture to go from trust but verify to never trust, always verify, you really have to build confidence in what you're doing. And so start with a small project and make that success. Don't try to boil the ocean.
That's great advice. Yeah. Matt, any final questions for Harry?
No, that was fantastic. It was a great overview, Harry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harry. Our listeners can visit edgewise.net/security weekly and register to learn more about Edgewise offerings. And there's tons of content. I know KT and team are working on lots of different content that's available on the website as well if you want more information. So, Harry, thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Excellent. Paul, Matt, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And with that, we'll take a short break, come back, and talk about the enterprise security news. Stay tuned.